It's both of those things. It's also the thing on which the thing that the animals are subjugated to stands, right? Because that's where the king is, and the king happens to be a lion, and the lion is a solar beast. It's always been a solar beast. It's associated with the sun. And it's the king of beasts because it's an apex predator. It's at the top of the hierarchy. And for whatever reason, although obviously the lions in the animated movie they're not actually lions. It's important to remember that while you're analyzing the film, because it's very easy to just think of them as lions, even though clearly they're not. Now you also see this little character up in the right-hand corner, left-hand corner, and that's Zazu, right? And Zazu is the eye of the king. And so the king is on top of the pyramid, but the king's eye is free from the king, and it can go all over the place, even where the pyramid can't see. And that's the eye on the top of the pyramid. You've seen that symbol everywhere, no doubt. It's the symbol that's on the back of the American dollar bill. And there's a reason for it. It's because the eye of the king is not part of the hierarchy. The eye of the king is something that's always free of the hierarchy and can fly over all hierarchies. And that's equivalent to the thing that could make its way up any hierarchy in some sense. It's also the same as Horus, the god of vision in the ancient Egyptian stories. Okay, so there we've got the king, and we'll see that he's on top of the rock, which is where the king belongs. He's also in full sunlight, even though that's not characteristic of any of the other animals. He's got his little bird there that tells him things, because the king is someone who pays attention. Because the king who doesn't pay attention is a tyrant. And then the wind is blowing through the king's hair because the wind is spirit. And so the king is also something that's associated with the everlasting spirit. Pneuma. Pneuma is the breath of air, and it's also the essence of life from an archetypal perspective. So to be inspired is like respiring. To be inspired is to take in spirit. And the kind of spirit that the king takes in is associated with the image of the wind. Now, you got to look at his face. You remember before I was saying, because the animators do a very good job of this, they gave him a very mature face. And a mature face is something out of which something is coming instead of something into which something is coming. And you'll see that the king, Mufasa, is always looking like this. He's very intent and focused and intimidating. Whereas his son, right up until he becomes initiated, is like this, always. As soon as he becomes initiated, and I'll show you that in the film, his face hardens. And it isn't until his face hardens that he can go back and fight Scar, who's basically a figure of the shadow. Now originally this character, Rafiki, was going to be one of those typical sort of Disney sidekick buffoons. That didn't work out so well in the narrative, and he ended up as a symbol of the self instead. And Rafiki is obviously a shaman, and he's the part of the psyche that guides its transformation. So here's another way of looking at the self. It's a very interesting idea. So, you know, as you go through life, there's going to be triumphs and then catastrophes, and when there's a catastrophe, the psyche falls apart, and then maybe it gathers its resources back together and pulls itself together. It's going like this. Well, Jung would say the self is what's guiding that process. So the ego feels it like this. So that's triumph and catastrophe, or tragedy and comedy. But the self is the thing that's underneath all of it, allowing those transformations to take place. And that's Rafiki, and that's why he's associated as well with the sun. So, and he's a good king because he's in touch with the self. So that makes him not something that's either serving his persona or his ego. But you could say that what he's serving is a manner of ruling that allows for the appropriate amount of stability and transformation to take place in the kingdom so that it remains stable but also adapting to change. And the king is guided in that by the little bird who tells him what's going on in those places he can't see. Now that's clearly a Madonna and child image. And the reason for that is quite simple. I mean, you might think, well, why would the idea of the Madonna and child, which by the way is a far older idea than the Christian representation of it. There's lots of figures of Madonnas and Madonnas and children? Yeah. In ancient Egyptian art, for example, and that would be Isis with Horus. Well, the reason that that's an archetype is because any society who doesn't regard the dyad of mother and infant as something sacred, which would mean of highest value, is doomed, obviously. Because without that being held as a value, the society will cease to propagate, and that will be the end of it. So if the society isn't structured so that that dyad is up among the highest of values, then the society has become ungovernably corrupt.